In the last lecture module, we noted, if you think the theoretical goal of epistemology is to come up with a definitional theory about the nature of knowledge, that is, to come up with a theory of knowledge that is equivalent to a definition, a theory that states the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for something to count as an instance of knowledge. If that's your goal, if that's what you think you've done with the justified true belief account of knowledge, then Gettier seems to pose this problem for your view, because those Gettier cases, at least at the intuitive level, they seem to be cases where a person has a belief, that belief is true, and they're justified in believing it, so that they satisfy all the individually necessary conditions under the justified true belief notion of knowledge. But intuitively, the person doesn't seem to know that thing that they believe, and hence the theory fails to capture only the cases of knowledge. That is, it's capturing maybe necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions. In this lecture module, we're going to turn our attention towards the responses to Gettier's original counterexamples. And what we'll discover is there was a response that emerged immediately in the philosophical community and a number of papers and so on. And this response said that, hey, wait a minute now. It seemed, at least for first blush, intuitively, that Smith's beliefs were justified and true, so that they satisfied that justified true belief set of conditions. But in fact, they aren't justified. If you look at them more carefully, then you realize they don't actually look like they're justified. They're not intuitively compelling as justified beliefs. And why is that? Well, they say, look, we start off in these examples with a belief that's justified, and then we make an inference and transfer our justification via that inference, and then we make another maybe and another. And so we have an initial belief, it's justified based on some evidence. Then there's this inferential transfer of justification from one belief to the next until we finally get to the target belief that Smith is supposedly justified in forming. But, these people say, one of the intermediary beliefs in that justificational transfer chain is supposed to transmit that justification from the initial belief to the target belief. That belief is false. And if that belief is false, it just stops justificational transference via inference immediately. There is no more transference if you hit a false belief in an inferential chain. And so they say, look, you've got this belief, it's justified. You make an inference to another true belief that transfers the justification, and you make another inference from that belief to another belief, transfers the justification. That belief, however, turns out to be false. Hence, it is no longer capable of transferring justification. Problem solved. Well, the response to this response is to defend the Gettier cases, to defend the notion that no, these examples are more robust than merely sneaking a false belief into an inferential chain. What they represent is something more significant. The first way that they can do that is if it seems like they're too strong. By prohibiting false beliefs in an inferential chain, they in fact seem to rule out cases that do seem to count as knowledge, that do seem to count as transmitting justification. And so, even though this doesn't appear in the literature really, I'm going to give you an example to illustrate this point. This response is too strong. It rules out too many cases to try and get rid of the problematic ones. And the example I refer to, call it the counting crows example. In the literature, the main response to this objection to the Gettier cases is made by people like Chisholm and Skirms and Feldman. And they essentially say, look, the problem with this objection is that it doesn't rule out all the Gettier type cases. We can come up with cases like the original Gettier cases in which there is no false belief. There is no break in that inferential chain because you got to a false belief and can't go any farther. And so there is inferential transference of justification via that inference. And as a result, you've got Gettier cases that aren't ruled out by this claim about false intermediary beliefs. And so Feldman publishes his paper. He gives an example that I refer to as someone's Ford. Chisholm gives an example, sheep in a field. Skirms talks about a pyromaniac and a barometer, and so on. But they all have this thing in common. Nothing about having initial evidence that warrants a belief from which you make some inferences requires that the belief be false in order to get to these Gettier cases, where we seem to have a justified true belief, but that belief turns out not to look like it counts as knowledge. Oftentimes, and Feldman suggests, what people want to do in response to the Gettier cases, once this amendment has been made, once this recognition that it's not going to be just dismissed on the basis of some simple principle like that, is that we add a clause. And the clause, Feldman, I believe, refers to it in that chapter as the warrant clause. We add a clause that is justified true belief and this stuff, where this stuff is the thing that makes sure that the justification isn't misleading. The being justified actually makes you more likely to be true in a way that rules out these Gettier cases. And we'll see if that looks plausible in future lectures. Trying to flesh that out, trying to come up with an account that deals with these Gettier cases has been sort of difficult within the traditional philosophical canon. We find people like Lehrer advocating defeasibility theory, Dredske experimenting with counterfactual theories of knowledge, and Goldman, who we'll be looking at next week. Goldman attempts to deal with the Gettier cases by arguing that if we maintain certain types of causal connections between the fact that makes a belief true and the belief itself, so that our inferences, when we use them, preserve that causal connection from fact to belief, then we don't have Gettier problems. Let's turn our attention then to that first response to Gettier cases. These people, Kenneth Stern, Robert Myers, D.M. Armstrong, they all look at these examples and they go, hey, wait a minute, these don't look like good counterexamples. Initially, you might have that intuition that Smith is justified in the target belief, so that Smith has a justified true belief, but that belief doesn't intuitively seem to count as knowledge. However, when we look more carefully at these cases, what we realize is that, hey, there's an inferential chain transferring justification through inference from an initial belief, and that all's fine. However, at one point in this chain, there's a false belief that gets inferred and then is used to make an inference to the next belief, so that there's an intermediate false belief in all of these chains. And if there's an intermediate false belief, they say, then we see that that can't be used to transfer justification through inference, so that once you hit that false belief in the inferential chain, justification just hits a wall and you don't get any more transference of justification. As a result, all of those target beliefs, the ones that Gettier points to and says, look, it's justified, it's true, it's a belief, but it doesn't seem like knowledge, they say, no, it seemed like it was justified, but in fact it's unjustified and true and believed, and so it's okay that it doesn't seem like knowledge. Within the literature, we see this response to the Gettier cases being criticized, and it's usually criticized because it is too weak. However, I think that it is both too strong and too weak. It's too strong in the sense that it rules out any case where we have an inferential transference of justification that involves at some point in some capacity a false belief. And that just seems like it's too strong. There seem to be some cases that we don't want to rule out as transferring justification through inference, but that run afoul of this rule. So let's take a look at an example. Suppose that you come to believe that many crows are black based upon thousands of observational beliefs that you form individually to the effect, there's a crow and it's black. Now, all but one of those crow beliefs are correct. In that one case, someone painted a seagull black. Now the question is, when you consider your belief, that original generalization belief, the belief that many crows are black, do you really want to say that that belief is no longer justified because of that one isolated belief in the thousands of observations that you've made? In fact, just that one belief, that's all it took. And that means that if I'm right, that principle, that you can't have a false belief anywhere in the inferential transfer of justification from one belief to another, those cases are all going to be ruled out. So every time that you make a generalization based on evidence, if even one of your beliefs, your evidential beliefs from which you make that justification transfer through inference, if even one of them is not true, then the justificational transfer transfer falls. So no matter how large your data set, all it takes is one false belief in that data set, and the generalization, no matter how weak the generalization is, many, lots of them, quite a few, or so on, that inferential transformation does not go through. And that just seems way too strong.